Here. So now we are back on. Okay, let me start again. So I'm John Phillimore, the director of the JCIPP. We've been running this thing for a long time. If you've never been on Curtain Corner before, I'm sorry about that. We're normally much more professional. For those of you who've been there before, you can just have a little chuckle and say, John's made a mistake, and have another glass of wine while you're waiting for Mark to start. So I'll start again, and I'll begin by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, the traditional owners of the lands from which I am hosting today's webinar, and wherever you're watching from, on your behalf, I pay my respects to traditional owners and their elders past and present. And as I was mentioning before, we've been running these things for about 20 years on a Friday afternoon. Speakers inside and outside universities, very varied topics related to politics and public policy. And we record the sessions. We put them up on our website. So I urge you to go and look at the website and see past talks. Encourage your colleagues to do the same. And in fact, if you go back to 2019, you'll be able to see Mark Beeson giving a talk from many years ago. It can take a week or so for the talk to appear, but it will be up shortly, I promise. And we do have recordings from many years past, so please go and check them out. We like to encourage debate. So later we invite you to ask questions of our speaker. And the way to do that is to go to a site called Slido, Slido. Many of you know how to do this, but if you don't, it's very easy. You just go to www.slido.com. You enter the event code, which is hashtag JCIPP. You can then submit a question there, or you can like somebody else's question, and I'll facilitate the discussion based on the questions that I receive. So now I would like to introduce today's speaker without any further ado, after that further ado that happened before. So Mark Beeson, an adjunct professor at the University of Technology, Sydney and Griffith University. Mark was previously Professor of International Politics at the University of Western Australia, most recently. But before joining UWA, he taught at Murdoch. I think I first met Mark when I was at Murdoch. Also Griffith University, Queensland, York in the UK, and Birmingham in the UK. So his work mainly is centred on politics, economics, and security of the Asia-Pacific region. And he's the author or editor of at least 20 books. He's a real workaholic is our Mark. He's always got a book coming out, and I noticed he had a book out recently. I thought I've got to go and talk to Mark again and get him to give a talk. So his latest book is Search for Security, AUKUS and the New Militarism, published by Melbourne University Press in 2025. And other book titles include, for example, Environmental Anarchy, International Security in the 21st Century, Rethinking Global Governance, and Environmental Populism, The Politics of Survival into Anthropocene. So this is Mark's second Curtain Corner. As I said, the last one was back in 2019. So it's been far too long between drinks, Mark, and it's really great that you volunteered again to do a Curtain Corner. So I'll leave it to you, and we'll come back to do the Q&A in a little while. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Sean, and it's a pleasure to be doing one of these again. And the intention of today's effort is to try and tell the audience something about middle powers, which have suddenly assumed a prominence that is surprising to some commentators, and not without its contradictions and puzzles. And I'll try to explain a few of those as we go along. But I look forward to hearing your questions and see what you make of all of the above. So. Let me start by introducing you to two heroes of democratic socialism, high-profile, charismatic characters that they both are. It's interesting, I've just come back from Britain and I gave a talk about something similar about Australia's relationship with China, and I had a photo of Anthony Albanese and Xi Jinping, and none of the audience, which was an educated, informed audience, knew who could name or recognize Albanese, which tells you something about the ability of Australian political leaders to cut through on some of these big issues. But anyway, one good thing about that trip to Britain was that it made me realise that Australia is not as badly governed as I'd come to think, and there are places that are having greater problems than we are, and that's part of the story of whether middle powers are actually going to amount to anything or be able to do anything. But before we get into that, let me just remind you that for those of you who have not been taking a keen and enthusiastic interest in the activities of middle powers, that there are different ways of categorizing political entities in the international system, some of which you'll be familiar with, and they're in descending order: superpowers, which used to be basically the United States and the Soviet Union, and now it's maybe United States and China. Great powers is a term that's used interchangeably in some cases to describe the most powerful states in the world, and maybe you'd include Russia, maybe you'd include India as a rising great power. But middle powers is a category somewhere in the middle between those great powers and what we might describe as failing states who don't have enough state capacity and state power to be able to do anything to solve their own problems, never mind the rest of the world's. But there's a large number of countries in that category of middle powers, and what unites them is not always immediately obvious, apart from not knowing what else to call them. And I'll get onto that a bit later. But middle power theory focuses primarily on this large band of countries that are secondary states, and they're primarily noteworthy because they're followers and not leaders, and great powers still metaphorically and realistically call the shots in many cases. This phrase, games of skill, not will, was coined, to the best of my knowledge, by a colleague and friend of mine, Richard Higgett, in a paper we wrote quite a few years ago about middle powers. And the idea there is that middle powers don't have the capacity to compel anybody to do anything they may not want to, but they might be able to persuade them to do things that are arguably in their interest and in the interest of the international system and quote unquote international community, if there is such a thing, of course. The other point to note at the outset, I think, is that middle powers are not necessarily progressive. And this is one of the problems with this kind of definition and way of thinking about them, because there's countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, lots of other countries that we might not always associate with progressive liberal causes can be categorized as middle powers, and that makes the whole usefulness or otherwise of this categorization a bit questionable. But I'll say more about that as we go along. So let me just give you a little bit of historical context about all of this discussion. And one of the things that may or may not be happening is the end of superpowers. As I've suggested, some people are suggesting that China and the United States are the current superpowers in the world, and I think lots of people would agree with that. But there are some important differences between the current historical juncture and the sorts of things that were going on during the Cold War. In, in the Cold War, there really was an ideological and military division that divided the entire planet just about, and it was reinforced by major expenditure on guns and bombs. This is still the case, as we'll see later on, but there was a very serious structural division between the United States and the Soviet Union that was reinforced by the doctrine of uh, mutually assured destruction, MAD, in that famous acronym. That's not quite as prevalent as it once was, as we'll see. But the idea that the world was bipolar and then changed into something else after the end of the Cold War is something that's fueled this kind of debate about the international system more generally and about middle powers in particular. Uh, I think the interesting point to know is that in 1989, when the Cold War came to a sudden and unexpected end, certainly unexpected to the kind of realist scholars and practitioners who dominated the thinking and practice about international relations until that time. This came as a real surprise. The Soviet Union disappeared without a shot being fired, and it seemed as if a new world order was really dawning. And there was a noticeable shift from what we might call geopolitics and old-fashioned interstate competition to geoeconomics. And this was captured in Bill Clinton's famous phrase about it's the economy, stupid. And everybody thought that from now on we can concentrate on economic development. We don't have to worry about uh, superpower competition and the prospect of imminent nuclear confrontation. which we narrowly escaped on a couple of occasions. We don't have to worry about that anymore, and we can all concentrate on getting rich and prosperous. That was until George W. Bush came along, and we went back to uh, unipolar business as usual, as it turned out, because at that time the Americans were unchallenged as the dominant power in the world. But for a moment during the 1990s, it seemed as if a new world order was being ushered in. And this was when Francis Fukuyama famously wrote about the end of history and the idea that we were all going to converge on a liberal democratic model, which was going to be attractive to everybody and just win the argument by the persuasiveness of its ideas. And that was another idea that seemed attractive, but as we shall see, didn't really last the test of time. Let me just say a little bit about Australia's middle power diplomacy, because for those of you who haven't been taking a keen interest in this, you may be surprised to hear that Australia and Australian scholarship has been at the forefront of trying to promote this idea of middle power diplomacy being a real thing that we could all get behind, take an interest in, and that might actually make a difference in the world. And there's a long quote from Gareth Evans, our former foreign minister in the Hawke government, who was a champion of middle power diplomacy and really thought, as I think still does, think that middle power diplomacy has the capacity to be able to put things on the international agenda, to be able to come up with ideas that perhaps the great powers or the superpowers might not be interested in promoting because they might actually offer a challenge or a different agenda, a set of ideas that the great powers might not be interested in promoting. And that could be a good thing, according to people like Gareth Evans and to lots of other people who are not happy about the prospect of a kind of second Cold War or renewed contestation between two great powers who might have the capacity to dictate to everybody else what might go on. And for Australia, this thing about the hub and spoke alliance relationship is a way of describing America's bilateral relations with a number of countries, particularly in East Asia and with the NATO countries, that the Americans dominate those strategic alliances, and this limits the options that are available to lesser powers like Australia and other alliance partners throughout the region. So there's a big question about the potential independence of middle powers when they are already in these kind of hub and spoke relationships with the United States in particular. This was always a problem, but it's becoming even more controversial, or it should be becoming even more controversial when the United States seems to have abandoned its commitment to allies and to multilateralism under Donald Trump. And you would think that if ever there was going to be a rethink about middle power diplomacy and just diplomacy generally and its capacity to be able to influence countries like the United States and indeed China, this would be the moment to think about it. And that's why I think there's been a resurgence of interest in middle powers as people are looking for ways of thinking differently about an international situation that seems to be heading in entirely the wrong direction. But the big question is, can Australia actually play the sort of independent role that some of the champions of Australian foreign policy and middle power diplomacy more generally would like to think? One of the things that I mentioned, this title, A Suitable Piece of Real Estate, comes from a famous book by an Australian scholar, Des Ball, who wrote very insightfully about the nature of alliance politics and the constraints that inevitably played on lesser powers like Australia. The interesting thing about Australia, of course, is that it's become a home for Australian troops, planes, submarines, and other military hardware because it's such a pivotally important landmass, which the Americans want to take advantage of because it suits their grand strategy and their desire in the past and now to contain China's rise as a peer competitor. So it's interesting that when you look back at Australia's history of strategic relationships, they've been at the forefront and rushing to give assistance to the Americans in a number of conflicts, in every conflict the Americans have been involved in fact, since the Second World War, despite the fact that they've had no real strategic relevance to Australia, and there's been no danger of Australia actually being affected by any of these conflicts. And not much has changed in that regard. Uh, Australia's participation has happened despite the fact that our modest military capacity, which we're about to try and increase, as I'll talk about later, despite the fact that Australia can't make any real difference in any major war, it's been an enthusiastic participant, and maybe this has given the Americans a fig leaf of legitimacy for some of their more questionable adventures in places like Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., etc. The other interesting thing about the Australian participation in these conflicts and the kinds of defence expenditure that's gone along with them is that there's been almost no significant debate about these kind of initiatives amongst political elites or especially the general public. We've just been excluded and nobody's terribly interested in our debates. And to be fair, I think foreign policy is not a big vote winner in most elections. So I think political elites think they can ignore the views of the electorate because they don't really count when it comes to winning or losing elections. What they do, I think, though, some of the high-profile commitments that Australia has made is that they attract negative commentary from some of our neighbours, not just from China, but some of our neighbours in Southeast Asia regard Australia as so locked into American strategic policy that we don't have a really independent foreign or strategic policy of our own. We are just slavishly going along with whatever ideas the Americans might have about strategic policy. And this was arguably a bad idea at any time. But with the administration of Donald Trump, it looks foolish in the extreme. And one would hope that our policymakers are at least thinking about it in private, even if they're not doing much in public. And what we see as a consequence of this adherence to America's strategic priorities rather than necessarily our own is that we're seeing a new era of containment emerging in the Indo-Pacific. And the target of this, of course, is China, which is also our chief trading partner, our regional neighbor. And it's worth remembering that China hasn't started any wars of choice since about the mid-1970s, when it had a very brief border skirmish with Vietnam in which it emerged bruised and battered. So I think China's not quite as worrying as a foreign policy actor as the United States is at the moment, but that's something that policymakers in this country simply cannot bring themselves to think about, never mind acknowledge. So let me say something about Australia's strategic context. Despite the fact that we have the most arguably favorable and benign geography in the world, we simply, the policy-making elites in this country at least, are simply paralyzed by the inherited discourse about insecurity that has dominated strategic thinking in this country since Australia was notionally an independent actor on the world stage at the turn of the 20th century. Not much has changed, and many of those fears and suspicions about Asia and our place in the region were reinforced by the Second World War, of course, when Britain was embarrassingly thrown out of Southeast Asia by the Japanese, and the Japanese actually looked as if they could invade Australia at that time. So there was some good grounds for worrying about Australia's strategic isolation, but a lot of it had to do with just a general sense of insecurity brought on by being strangers in a strange land, as it were. Now, something unfortunate seems to be happening to my. Oh, here we go. So there's been a lot of ambivalence about our place in Asia, particularly about China's role in the region as well. So, one of the manifestations of this general uncertainty about our place in the region and strategic vulnerability was the initiation of the ANZUS alliance, which has been the unquestioned bedrock of Australian security ever since, despite the fact that New Zealand dropped out of it with no apparent diminution of New Zealand's national security, which is something that's worth keeping in mind as well, because despite the fact that New Zealand doesn't have much of an army, doesn't have much of a navy, nobody's queuing up to invade New Zealand as a consequence, and they are no more threatened than they were before. So that's just something that's worth keeping in mind, I think. This general allegiance to the United States and the idea that we can't get along without them has now been extended to the AUKUS submarine project between us, the Americans, and the United Kingdom. Why the United Kingdom wants to send gunboats back to the Far East is an open question, but I think as far as Australia is concerned, there was a fear that the Australian Labor Party would look weak on security if they didn't support Scott Morrison's harebrained idea about buying nuclear submarines rather than cheap and cheerful ones from the Japanese or the French. But that's another debate we can get into if people are interested. But as I say, Australia, even if we have these AUKUS submarines, which I don't think that will ever arrive, certainly not in my lifetime, the Americans can't build enough for their own supposed needs. The British shipbuilding capacity is, I think they'd be the first to admit, not great. But even if we did get these submarines, if China is not deterred by Americans' overwhelming firepower, they're not going to be deterred by us having one or two or three or four nuclear powered, but of course not nuclear armed submarines that Australia may or may not control or have a sovereign capability over. So, in these circumstances, it's still remarkable, it seems to me, although I would say this obviously, the critics of the uh, Australian strategic policy and the AUKUS project in particular are not taken terribly seriously, despite the mind-bending cost of the entire project. Now, you may know this chap. This is Mark Carney. He's the former governor of the Bank of England and now the Prime Minister of Canada. And he made a speech recently at the Davos meeting in Switzerland, which brings together the world's plutocrats and what we used to know as the ruling class in the old days for a powwow about the state of the world. And Carney made an impressive speech which attracted much attention and brought the idea of middle power diplomacy to the forefront of discussions in the so-called international community, which was a good thing. But his idea of a rupture in the old order and the dawn of a new middle power moment certainly did capture the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, and captured everybody's attention as a consequence of this. And many people, including me, got very excited about this overdue recognition of the international reality that we inhabit. But unfortunately, it was a case of identifying a problem, but perhaps not following through terribly effectively about the very problems that he managed to identify so correctly, in my view. And the problem was that when Carney came to Australia recently, a couple of months back, he was asked about Trump's role in the undermining of the very order that the Americans did so much to develop and build and oversee in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Americans bizarrely were undermining this international order, of which they were the principal beneficiaries in many ways. But when Carney was asked to critique Trump's role in this, he declined the opportunity to do so, just as he had failed to name Trump and the American administration in his Davos speech, which drew attention to this and the changes that were unfolding in the international system at that time. So this was something of a disappointment. He didn't get any support from Australia, which is possibly less of a surprise to those of us who've been following these kinds of debates. And I think it highlights the problem that even if middle powers and middle power leaders have some good ideas from time to time, it takes courage and imagination to actually follow through on them and to try to get them on the international agenda and taken seriously, and to think of ways of getting people to take them seriously as possible policy initiatives. To be fair, there have been a couple of people uh, if Spanish Prime Minister, the Macron in France has been speaking up. There have been a number of attempts to change the debate and to get new ideas put on the agenda, but it's a struggle, and Australia hasn't been doing much to help. Partly because it's locked into this kind of strategic relationship with the Americans, but partly I think because the policy making elites in countries like Australia in particular and the strategic elites who advise them simply cannot imagine any other world order than the one that we've inhabited for the last 80 years or so, and which is falling apart before our eyes at the moment. So, if ever there was a moment to have a little bit of a rethink about things, you would think this would be it. But as they say, don't hold your breath. Now, I'm going to talk about an article. I don't know how many of you read the American Journal of Foreign Affairs, which is very influential. But a couple of days ago, an article came out by a chap called Michael Beckley. I'm just going to run through a couple of the claims that he makes in this article, which is well worth a read. It's a very good article, even though I disagree with lots of it. But it's a kind of realist critique of the obstacles that middle powers face in trying to do anything effective or meaningful that goes against the wishes of the great powers. And this is a kind of discourse that's emanated from America for years because they do and they have dominated the international system to a serious extent, whatever the impact might have been on other countries uh, in the international order. Now, I'll let you read this, but the basic kind of idea is that middle powers really can't have the kind of influence that great powers do because, as Beckley says, there's no substitute for raw power. So if you don't have the ability to be able to build lots of guns and bombs, the technology to keep them up to the cutting edge of military hardware, if you don't have the industry, intelligence, etc., and of course the willingness to use these, then you're not in the game really, and you're deluding yourself if you think you can compete with other countries that do have the raw power to make these kinds of decisions. And clearly, in America's case, they also have the willingness to use them unilaterally against perceived opponents. And the strategy that many of the Southeast Asian neighbors have adopted of so-called hedging, not aligning with one great power or another, according to Beckley, this is going to look like betrayal soon, and Trump in particular will possibly insist that potential allies put their money where their mouth is and align themselves unambiguously with a one superpower or another. Otherwise, they cannot rely on America, in this case, to come to their aid. Now, whether we can rely on America to come to our aid under any circumstances, no matter how much money we give them or how much we and assure them that we will do so, is an open question at the moment. But according to Beckley, this is no longer going to be an option, and hedging will be frowned upon by the great powers. The other problem for middle powers, and this is a legitimate and quite telling criticism, it seems to me, is that trying to develop coalitions of middle powers along consistent lines and on issues that they can agree on is a real challenge. And the bigger the grouping, the more difficult it is to come to any agreement about what they want to do and their ability to be able to act quickly on key issues. So smaller groups are better, but maybe not so impactful. Larger groups are good as far as having an impact on the world, but they make it difficult to come to a consensus on what it is that they're trying to do. And that's not a bad point to make. So Beckley's conclusion is that middle powers are going to have less and less ability to be able to choose what they want to do, choose who they want to align with. The reality, according to realists, is that we live in a hierarchical world where power determines who's at the top of the pecking order, and if you don't have that, you're going to have less and less room for maneuver, and you're just going to have to recognize that this is the way the world is, and according to realists, it's the way that the world always has been, and of course always will be, according to them. And according to Beckley, the danger is mistaking the performance of autonomy for the substance of power. So it's all about who's got the most guns and bombs, who's got the greatest willingness to use them if they're challenged by other states. The only way that we avoided having a cataclysmic war during the Cold War was because of the logic of mutually assured destruction. We seem to be moving back towards something that looks alarmingly like that with the confrontation between China and the US. But according to realists like Beckley, this is the way the world works, and we are naive idealists if we don't recognize this and make decisions according to that logic. So that's all a bit depressing and deflating, no doubt. So let me just kind of run through, by way of conclusion, some of the consequences of this. And I think the sobering and dispiriting key point to make about this is that realists, with all their appalling assumptions about human nature, the nature of the international order, and our inability to cooperate, they may be right about the current system and the kind of people who run it and the kind of assumptions that they make about the way the world works and their counterparts in other countries around the world. Unfortunately, most of the decision makers in the world, they buy into this kind of realist view of the world, and people like Albanese will tell you that the first responsibility of any national government is to protect our sovereignty and to defend ourselves against potential threats. There may be something in that, but I don't think they're protecting us against the right potential threats. And that's another story. Even if we accept that American hegemony once benefited countries like Australia, which I think is true, and this is the great paradox of America's contemporary foreign policy agenda, because lots of countries in what we describe as the global north did benefit from the so-called rules-based international order that the Americans were prominent in creating in the aftermath of the Second World War, when let's not forget that capitalism after the Great Depression didn't look like a very viable and sustainable system for a while. So it needed some saving, and America stepped into the breach, as it were, and created or helped to oversee the development of a system which, for a number of countries, led to their resuscitation and 30 years of unparalleled economic development and progress. The question is, has that system now begun to unravel? And did it ever benefit all of the countries in the world, even when it was at the height of its powers? So these are questions that are being asked and should be asked more forcibly, it seems to me. So at the moment, it's possible to argue, and I put that in brackets because I don't want to seem as if I'm ranting too uncontrollably about American foreign policy at the moment, but I think it's possible to make a quite plausible argument that the principal threat to the international order at the moment is the United States itself under the erratic, unpredictable, and frankly self-destructive foreign policy and strategic policy agenda of the Trump administration. I don't think we've ever had an American administration like them before. Whether we're going to survive them is an open question, but I think that there's a lot to worry about and a lot that we should think about if we're going to have a more sustainable environment. And part of this sustainable environment means a sustainable natural environment. And I think, rightly or wrongly, that the climate change remains the greatest problem that the human race has ever faced. And it's a collective challenge and it needs a collective response. And America is not only doing nothing to alleviate this problem, it's actually making it worse by giving fossil fuel companies an invitation to drill, baby, drill, etc., etc. And let's not forget that blowing up Iran, blowing up Gaza by supplying the weapons to the Israelis to do these kinds of things, one day, we hope, we're going to have to rebuild all that stuff, and that's going to release an awful lot of CO2, which is going to add to the problem of climate change, of course. So the things we are doing at the moment, to use a bit of a technical term from international relations, are completely bonkers, and I think we really have to have a bit of a rethink about some of the things that we're doing. So I would argue, for what it's worth, and I'm happy to take advice on this, that cooperation is just not one option among many. It's the only hope of preserving the civilization and environment upon which we all depend. And it's not just me saying this, you'll be relieved to hear, or not, as the case may be, but climate scientists have been banging on about this for 20, 30, 40 years, however long it is now. And I don't think it's that controversial to suggest that they've probably been right all about this, and that people like me who can't do the climate science would be foolish not to take their word for it because they know an awful lot more about it than I do. And there's an intellectual division of labor in the world and universities, or there should be, where we do accept the insights and wisdom of people who've made a career out of studying climate change and those kinds of things, and people like Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who also takes their advice seriously and thinks that our very civilization is in danger if we don't act more sensibly than we are doing at the moment. And as a final uplifting and buoyant note, let me just suggest to you that there are a couple of unlikely beacons of hope. I should say that I'm a big fan of the European Union. It's worth remembering that the European Union uh, brought together foes like France, Germany, Britain, countries that had, shed oceans of blood over the years and made Europe one of the most violent continents in the world. And it became a model of cooperation, institutionalized, useful relationships, oversaw unprecedented economic development and peace in a war-torn region for at least 3 decades. No small achievement, and our best example ever of the kind of institutionalized cooperation we need to see on a global basis, not just within one of the more fortunate parts of the world. China, you might be surprised to hear, is also doing more than the US to bring about a happier state of affairs. For one thing, they don't go around unilaterally invading other countries, or not so far at least. We hope that stays the case in Taiwan. But they also use a language about ecological civilization, and they put their money where their mouth is. Half of China's energy now comes from renewable technologies, and they're exporting it to other parts of the world, like Africa, that desperately need cheap, reliable energy to manage their transition to a hopefully better world. So, if you're thinking about comparing and contrasting China and the United States, it's not an obvious choice to make that that the United States is still the best bet for the future of humanity or for the future of Australia. So, on that cheerful and chirpy note, I'll leave my observations and welcome and look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. So just stop sharing your screen, and then we'll
If I can figure out how to do that, I'd happily do it. Stop sharing. There we go.
right, we're in. Okay. Well, thanks very much for that. That was terrific. And we've already got some questions coming through, but just reminding everybody, go to www.slido.com, and then you enter our code, which is JCIPP, and that gets you onto Slido, and you can ask some questions or vote for other people's questions. So, Mark, you've got a nice question here to begin with. I think the question is, should Australia pivot seriously away from all the way with LBJ, and realistically, could it align with countries such as Japan, South Korea, and possibly even India? I mean, of course, that's to some extent assumes that Japan, South Korea, and India are aligned and not quite all the way with LBJ either. So, what's your view on if you did try and move away from the US, are we aligning with anybody else, or are we all on our own?
Well, I think as an initial step, uh, trying to develop closer relations with our immediate region is a good idea. Southeast Asia would be an important place to start. There's a very good book by Sam Rogovin about the possible benefits of having a focusing on just our local defense commitments and using Indonesia as a useful uh, barrier against any prospective invaders from north. I mean, the idea that anybody is seriously thinking about invading us is, I think, laughable, and certainly will be in my lifetime. But anyway, that's another story. But we could certainly try to form greater and closer relationships between ourselves and our regional neighbours. And I recently wrote an article to be provocative to some extent, I have to say, which was called China, column, our new great and powerful friend. And it was in part a bit of a wind-up, but it was trying to get people to think about the nature of our relations and our strategic location in this region in a new and different way. In an ideal world, it would be nice if we didn't have to align with anybody in terms of our security relationships. I know that's hopelessly naive, but even if we take these kind of strategic concerns seriously, I just don't think we need to spend quite as much money as we do on some of the exotic hardware we're trying to buy, or to constrain our strategic actions to the wishes of another foreign power that at the moment is unpredictable, unreliable, and a source of great instability in the world. So I do think we need to think differently, and I do think we should think about having closer ties with obvious partners like the European Union, like ASEAN, like Japan, although Japan is positioning itself to be a slightly more robust military power than it used to be to get on side with the Trump administration. And this is really unfortunate in my view, because I think Japan was a really useful and very rare example of a country that had repudiated militarism because they saw what it could lead to, a catastrophic war with the United States and having a couple of atomic bombs dropped on you. So I think there's some good arguments in favor of a less uh, warlike stance amongst our allies and friends.
Okay, I mean, just following on from what you just said, then you said ideally we should be more independent in terms of our military alliances, and basically we could stand alone. But your final slide talked about the need for cooperation. I know that you're talking about cooperation on issues like climate change, but leaving, if you like, those issues aside, I mean, can a country be independent militarily and not be on in an alliance of any sort? In which case, what are they?
Absolutely.
What are
No,
they?
there.
What are the weapons then for? I mean, who are they? I mean, it just seems a small country, which maybe talks about your previous, the second last slide about the guy who just written the article in Foreign Affairs.
Well, I just see. I'm not quite sure what the figure is at the moment. How many trillions of dollars we collectively spend on guns and bombs every year between us? It's mostly the Americans and the Chinese these days, but we're going to about to spend an awful lot of money, 368 billion at least. If we put that money to other uses, for example, we could solve the social housing crisis. We could have free education at universities for students. We could fix the healthcare system. We could do a lot of really useful things domestically and we could finance the green transition, of course, of which we are one of the worst offenders in the world in terms of per capita emissions. So we could do something useful about that. And if you accept my argument that climate change remains the biggest challenge that the world faces, not just Australia, then that's a pretty wise investment, it seems to me. But getting to a stage where there's a collective recognition that spending money on armaments is probably not the most sensible use of the world's collective resources at this particular juncture in history. Because if we learn one lesson from arms races and endless spending on military hardware, it comes from the First World War, where everybody thought, oh, we've got all this deterrence, we've got all these alliances, we're never going to have a war until, of course, alliances only work until they don't work. And then we find ourselves in a cataclysmic conflict, and the chances of it going nuclear with people like Putin around and other people can't be ruled out either. So I think just the effort of trying to move in a progressive direction towards spending less on arms, etc., might have a very useful effect on international relations. I mean, the idea that the Americans should be cooperating rather than competing, it just seems like an absolute no-brainer to me. China and America should be cooperating on climate change and on arms reduction. I just cannot see a good contrary argument to either of those propositions personally,
Okay,
especially from an insignificant country like Australia.
sure. Someone asks, to what extent has the hierarchy of global power depended on ownership or access of fossil fuel energy or fossil energy? And is that about to change? And if so, I mean, what's the implications of that? So, you've got, in some argue, you've actually got two blocks emerging, one still based on fossil fuels and one maybe based on renewables. So,
Yes, no, that's a good and interesting question, and there's no doubt that having a command of vital resources is important, and one of the many measures of power and the things that make some countries much more powerful than others. But it seems to me again, perhaps I'm just a sort of naive aging hippie, I don't know, but it seems unfortunate to me that every kind of thing that has critical minerals we're all obsessed with these days. And of course, the first thing that happens about they countries seek to weaponize them, use them as a source of strategic advantage over their competitors. And this, again, doesn't seem like a happy state of affairs to me, and one that could be rethought in a serious and sensible way. Because I do think if we're ever going to have a kind of stable world, we it's going to be inclusive of every. This is going to sound hopelessly naive, but it's going to be inclusive of the Sudanese and the Haitians and various other people that we never bother talking about and get written out of the kind of forthcoming agenda. But I think it's not unreasonable to suspect that given climate change and their existing problems, they're going to be keen to leave where they are now because they're going to become uninhabitable. That's going to create problems of climate change refugees and various other breakdowns of order in other parts of the world. And it's not a happy state of affairs for trying to think through and address complex, unprecedented international problems which demand forms of cooperation which we simply don't see in the world at the moment. So I think this instinctive urge to compete, to weaponize, and to seek advantages in the short term over potential or perceived competitors is not helpful, and I don't think it's going to do much for our chances of survival in anything like a civilized state.
But following on, or to some extent, from the fossil fuel question, though, someone says, does the possible reduction in US weapons and ammunition caused by the Iran war indicate the demonstration of power by a middle power, i.e., Iran, over a great power? I mean, I would I would say a couple of things about that. In addition, one is a lot of the wars in recent past, some would argue, have been about fossil fuels to some extent. I mean, Iran, Iraq, now Iran, and secondly, um, Iran has shown, it seems, that it can, hit back very effectively.
Mm.
Um, is that an example of is Iran a middle power in that sense? Is that the sort of, which is what I was sort of trying to get at before a little bit? Can a middle power with a serious amount of resources, either military or drones or whatever, actually demonstrate their own power? Do you need to have that to be a middle power? Because if you don't have that, what are you?
Well, as I say, there's a definitional problem, but clearly some middle powers are more powerful than others, do have strategic assets that can be weaponized, used to intimidate other countries. And I think part of the problem about the current relationship between Iran and the United States is a yet another unnecessary war of choice, which clearly wasn't thought through by its proponents. They didn't expect. They just thought, take out the leadership of Iran, game over. There'll be an uprising. The Democrats will surge for. I mean, a complete misunderstanding and misreading of the country of Iran, as they did with Iraq and other countries in the past as well. So but clearly, Iran does have, as Mr. Trump would say, some cards to play, and they're playing them pretty effectively in many ways. If we just use the short-term calculus of trying to inflict pain on a competitor and encourage them to come to terms in some way or other. So I think there are things that different countries can do. I mean, one of the things that we saw in the 1970s was the rise of OPEC and the power of the OPEC countries in the Middle East to be able to demand higher prices for oil. So those kinds of things can happen. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But I think there's a question mark about the big picture, about leadership, about what kind of ideas look, in principle, sustainable. Don't get me wrong, I've got absolutely no optimism that any of the ideas that I've been tentatively putting forward have any chance of being realized. And I'm afraid I do think the realists are right in suggesting that this is the way that politics and conflicts are likely to play out because they always have been, and the people who make decisions about these kinds of things simply can't imagine any other kind of world than the one that we are currently inhabiting. And the Iran conflict confirms many of those beliefs. And I think, what everybody seems to be doing at the moment is saying America's unreliable, therefore we've got to start paying for our own defense needs in a more, well, I don't dare use the word sustainable, but in a more coercive sort of way, or give us that kind of power as well. Otherwise, we're done for. And I just think that's such a short-sighted, bleak view of our collective future, and collective in the sense of us as a species. And I think, Donald Trump being the most powerful, I don't like to go on about him, but it just seems such an indictment of us as a collective species that the most powerful man in the world is so incompetent, clearly unqualified for the job, corrupt, impetuous, possibly going senile. I mean, it is an unfortunate comment on our ability as a species to come to sensible decisions about the way the world works. But sorry to editorialize, but you did give a leading question.
Yeah, sure. It's also by coincidence sort of follows on a bit. Is New Zealand, who you did mention before as a country that sort of stepped off the at least off the ANZUS rat race, is New Zealand a middle power, or how would you define New Zealand?
Yes, but for the context of this discussion, yes, New Zealand's a small middle power, if you like, but it comes into that group, a large group of countries that has some effective state capacity. It can do some things. It can be influential. When Jacinda Ardern was Prime Minister of New Zealand, people had actually heard of her, thought she was great, thought she was interesting, had some good ideas. I mean, nobody's heard of Albanese in Europe, but people had heard of Jacinda Ardern because she came up with a different kind of agenda that was thoughtful, didn't rely on this kind of traditional trying to project power, because there's a recognition in New Zealand they can't do that. They have to do other things. And part of that is just coming up with sensible ideas that reflect the kinds of positions that those countries find themselves in. And I think what we're desperately needed in the world, and I have sort of moments of hope that Australia might even play this kind of role, is for countries to stand up and just demonstrate that there are other ways of doing things and that they may be more sustainable in the long run. For example, I mean, again, I suggested somewhat ironically that Australia could try to come to a more cooperative relationship with China. We could stop digging up coal. China could stop building coal-fired power stations. We could cancel the AUKUS nuclear submarines, which would be a great benefit to us in cost savings. China could stop building aircraft carriers, because if there's one thing we know, if there is a major confrontation between China and America, aircraft carriers are going to last about 10 minutes probably, despite the fact that they cost an awful lot of money. So there are sensible things that I think that we could do, or just having discussions about these kinds of things, it seems to me at least, would be an enormous step forward from where we are now, whereas building aircraft carriers, having nuclear powered submarines are seen as vital parts of our overall strategic posture. I mean, if that's the reality, then Lord help us, it seems to me. And I think, New Zealand sets quite a useful example in that regard, and so does Costa Rica. They haven't had an army for about 40 years. Nobody's queuing up to invade Costa Rica either. I know they're small countries, they don't count in the scheme of things. That's why it's good to form alliances of small, not very powerful countries, just to demand that we have a more sensible discourse about where the world's heading and the real problems that are coming to get us if we don't do something about them very, very quickly.
So, are you sort of saying that, in a sense, Australia should not so much withdraw from the world, but given, I mean, remember, Australia's got 5 times the population of New Zealand, got vast amount of resources. Are there two types of middle power? Middle powers who have, if you like, independent militaries and who are reasonably strong militarily, and those who, I think you're arguing, Australia should be a non-military middle power who can basically just protect itself behind its geography and say, well, we're lucky, but therefore we'll set an example to the world through other means. Is that pretty much what you're
Yes,
saying?
I think partly, yep. I think, this is going to sound hopeless naive as well, but I mean, while we're at it, I mean, might as well go the whole hog. But I think Australia is the proverbial lucky country. I know Donald Horne meant that ironically, and he was talking about the incompetence of the ruling elites, which still pervades clearly. But in some ways, we are the lucky country. We've got an entire continent to ourselves. There's 26 million of us. We've got unbelievable resource riches, and yet we can't. There's people sleeping on the streets in Australia. There's people who don't have anywhere to live. The education system's too expensive for kids to take part in sometimes. There are all these kinds of things that could be easily fixed by a rich, wealthy country like Australia. So there's a domestic payoff for what we could do as a country. We could demonstrate to the rest of the world that by not spending all that money on submarines, not only are we just as safe as we were before, but we can do useful things for our own citizens. And this is a slightly more unlikely event still. We could do useful things for the rest of the world, because it seems to me that given our unbelievable good fortune, we have a moral obligation to set a good example to the rest of the world and to do something for some of the less fortunate parts of the world, of which there is an increasing number, and an increasing number of other human beings around the world are living in the most appalling circumstances. And this is not even including being randomly bombed by the Israelis and various other people. But they are struggling for survival as it is. And, we, being one of the most fortunate countries in the world, could do something useful to help that. And just the very effort of doing so, it seems to me, in my naivety, no doubt, that might encourage other countries to follow suit. And, the Norwegians, the Scandinavians, there have been other countries who've been at the forefront of trying to do something. And if middle power diplomacy is about anything, it ought to be about that, about encouraging good behavior, about trying to promote norms of solidarity and cooperation rather than conflict and enmity. I mean, it doesn't, it doesn't seem that sort of implausible an argument to make in some ways, apart from the fact that nobody thinks it's possible.
Okay, now we're going to zip through a few questions because we're getting a few here. We've only got about 15 minutes to go. So, a quick one. Will US return to a more normal state after Trump, or is he just the start or catalyst of a change to unilateralism?
This is an excellent question. You won't be surprised to hear that I've got a gloomy view of this. I've got a bet on with some friends of mine that the midterm, which I made last year, that the midterm elections won't happen because Trump knows he's going to lose them now, and he'll say, "Oh, we couldn't possibly have midterm elections in the context of an ongoing war with Iran or whoever else it might be by that stage." I hope I'm wrong about that. But the idea that America will return to normal when Trump goes. There's absolutely no guarantee of this at all anymore. And lots of serious scholars in America are very worried about America's path to authoritarianism. And on an analysis of fascism, Trump ticks every box. The alarming prospect is that Trump, we hope, is going to shuffle off this mortal coil in the not too distant future. And he's not supposed to have a third term. But imagine if Pete Hegseth took over as the next prime president of the United States. I mean, that boy is a real. Anyway, I shouldn't say too much and personalize it too much, but the general uh, uh, point to make is that there are some people in the Trump administration who are absolutely thoroughly alarming, not big fans of democratic processes. The Supreme Court has been seriously undermined by Trump's handpicked appointees, and the fabled checks and balances are in danger of being systematically undermined and possibly for all time. So I just don't think we can be completely confident that we're ever going to go back to business as usual, particularly when the climate it's packing up around us as well. They'd be most unfortunate circumstances for trying to make sensible, informed, long-term decisions.
Okay. Um, Someone asks, how important are ideological differences within the region, this region here, and should perceived human rights interfere with the practical benefits of trade and security?
No, excellent question. I mean, China's the biggest offender in this regard. I'm going to China next week because this won't do much for my reputation. I know. I'm going to Xinjiang to have a look at what's going on with the poor old Uyghurs who've been bossed about by the Chinese and the Han Chinese in Beijing, and it's not a happy story. There are lots of terrible things going on, repression, violation of human rights around the world. America's even worse violator of human rights at the moment in terms of declaring unilateral wars, expelling people from the United States even when they've been born there. So I mean, nobody is. I mean, we're bad at it. All those people out in Nauru, wherever it is, that are still spending their lives locked up and for reasons that can be debated. It's a horrible problem about what you do about human rights, defending them, about immigration, about trying to escape from places that are becoming unlivable. It's a real problem, but again, it demands cooperation rather than just simply writing these people off and saying, bad luck, you're living in the wrong country. So, yes, I don't have any easy answers to that one, I'm afraid.
So you think we still have to basically trade and form alliances with countries even and not let human rights considerations basically be a stopper on those things?
Yeah, I mean, most of the things that I've been saying today have got absolutely no chance of being realized. But the idea that we would break off relations with China, for example, because they've got a dodgy human rights record, or the same thing with America. I mean, it's just not going to happen. I mean, everybody recognizes that, and but I think we could continue to express our concern about these things. We could offer to take in some people. We could even better, one of the reasons why people want to leave the countries they live in is because the countries they live in are increasingly decrepit and incapable of supporting, well, life generally, never mind a decent life. We could do something perhaps to try to alleviate those kinds of problems through some collective effort overseen by the United Nations, etc., etc. And people will be rolling their eyes about that suggestion as well, no doubt. But I just don't see what the alternative is unless we're just going to turn our back on millions of other people in the world and say, bad luck, you're living in the wrong place, not our responsibility, sort yourselves out, which is the kind of Trumpian. I think Mr. Trump delicately refers to these places as shithole countries. So it gives you an idea about his kind of concern about other people in the world.
Okay, we're going to do some quickies now. What alternative options to AUKUS does Australia have? Which may well be in your book, so go and buy the book. But for example, I mean, country still has to have some, unless you're Costa Rica, you think you're still going to have some sort of defence force. So, for example, unmanned Australian ghost shark submarines, or a big drone force, which I assume would be a lot cheaper than having AUKUS. Do you think there's an argument for those sorts of different types of defence?
Undoubtedly, there is. I've got some friends who've made some sophisticated arguments about the benefits of having cheaper Japanese submarines or French submarines who would be more than adequate for our token presence and contribution to regional security. The other point about the AUKUS submarines, speaking about drones, is people who know much more about this than me think we're going to be dealing with the quote unquote transparent ocean in a very short period of time, which means that cheap and cheerful drone technology will be able to find even the quietest submarines in the ocean and, of course, destroy them. And so all our investment in cheap submarines, in nuclear submarines, may not amount to much because they'll be overtaken by forms of cheap drone technology. So I think there are other things that could be done. I can't imagine a situation where we won't have some kind of defense force. But the question is, what is a realistic defense force for our real needs? Because I don't think anybody's thinking of invading us. I don't think China wants to cut off our sea lanes, given that China is the biggest exporting country in the world. So the kind of threats that we face are minimal, it seems to me, rightly or wrongly, and therefore our defense forces should reflect that judgment, and we should save ourselves a pot of money and not be beholden to other countries to determine our strategic outlook.
Okay, so Warwick Smith's asked a couple of questions. Sorry, Warwick, you had to wait a bit. The first one is, if the US political system and, in fact, the global media can't handle complexity or can't communicate it properly, can wicked problems ever be resolved? I mean, so this is more a question, I think, about media and communications, because it's in a world, as you know, we haven't even talked about social media or AI or anything.
Uh,
How one communicates is pretty important. So at the moment, you've got, in some respects, an amazing communicator in the White House through very short, sharp, easy to understand,
yeah.
even if they're contradictory things. So how does one get around the fact that we can't handle complexity?
Excellent question. And for those of us who've, worked in academia, well, one of the things is to remember that, the places that we work in academia, they're supposed to be, you know, places where we develop critical thinking and ability to think for ourselves. And yet, universities like the University of Western Australia can't comment on Curtin, won't comment on Curtin, but UWA, there's no sort of defense industry or uh, cheer squad for the Americans that they won't, form a centre of simply to make sure that they get any money that's available and don't worry too much about the future. And they're not keen on people criticising them for doing it. So, but how you get a different discourse, maybe social media is one way that to some extent that might be done. I don't use social media. I don't know. Don't pretend to have an answer to that question, but it is a formidable challenge. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But people like me ranting about it may be the beginning of the global revolution we so desperately need.
Okay. I had a question right at the beginning, just because I wanted to get the ball rolling. Was isn't the non-US NATO and even Australia's reasonably lukewarm support of the US in Iran a signal of some middle power independence?
Yes, I think it is a bit. I mean, Australia, I think would have probably joined in if it hadn't been for the fact that the Europeans and the Brits and a few others had tried to signal that they weren't going to get involved in that. So it gave them a bit of cover, if you like, and they weren't going to be isolated by it. So, but I think it's the least they can do. If the most powerful country in the world is doing something completely stupid, illegal, unilateral and likely to end in the same kind of disasters we've seen time after time. I mean, when are they going to step up and do something and try to indicate that, well, we don't really think you're doing the right thing here and it might be a good idea to stop? There has to be a time when people recognize, and there will be a time when we get shaped by forces, environmental and others, where we'll have to think differently and act differently. The challenge is to act while we've still got a few options, while we might be able to use, persuasion, different kinds of ideas, and informed debate rather than just relying on trying not to offend the Americans.
Okay, a couple more, just last three really. One asks, given that Southeast Asian countries also worry about China's rise, particularly its huge military buildup, wouldn't they see Australia as a source of balance? Of course, you could also argue, wouldn't they see the US as a source of balance? So, where the Southeast Asian countries fit in this middle power uh, sort of scenario?
Well, they're not a great advert for effective middle powerdom, I don't think, unfortunately, because there are lots of divisions within the ASEAN countries, and the idea of, everybody's got to reach a consensus and everybody's got to agree, and then it's not binding anyway. It's not a great example of effective power diplomacy. But having said that, it's better that it does exist than it doesn't exist, because it kind of embeds a few norms and people get used to hanging out with each other at exotic sort of diplomatic shindigs. So that's all kind of good. And it's the sort of thing that we need. It's not enough, but it's something, and it's better that you have those kind of organizations, even if they're a bit feeble, than not having them at all. So it's a step, but I mean, it's just the time frame that we need to think about. We've got to stop stupid wars, which are completely pointless, unnecessary, and we could have done with that. And we've got to do something about climate change. And neither of those big problems lends themselves to dilly-dallying and just having endless conferences. And, Buckley in that article I mentioned is absolutely right about that.
Okay, so moving from the South ASEAN and Southeast Asia as a potential middle power sort of diplomacy, as a fan of the EU, are you able to give us some idea as to how Europe can protect itself against Russian revanchism? Great word.
Yeah, yes. No, I mean, it's just so depressing that Europe finds itself, because it was the one continent that seemed to have freed itself of these kind of old-fashioned, unnecessary, pointless, stupid, avoidable conflicts that do nobody any good. And it's now being demonstrated that Russia can't even win. The number of Russians that are being killed in this conflict, I think we're up to about 500,000 or something completely
Yeah.
bonkers. So it's just unbelievable. And for what, we might ask ourselves. So, yes, the European project is threatened by this kind of boneheaded aggression from Putin. And the big hope is that I think the Russians wake up and get rid of Putin one way or another, or some of his cronies do. But they're kind of, the danger is to allow those kinds of people to emerge in the first place, and having a different discourse about the kind of political systems we would like to see and the way that they're run would be part of that. But that's a long-term project, and maybe we haven't got that time. But it would be one of the great tragedies of human history, in my view, if the European Union falls apart or has to turn all its attention to building its defenses rather than building a prosperous future for a a common project. And the great thing about the European Union is French and German people cannot imagine going to war with each other anymore in a way that their ancestors did for generation after generation. And if that's not a big uh, tick for the European Union and its existence, it's hard to know what is, because that is exactly where we want to be on a global scale, where stupid conflicts are unimaginable and everybody else in the world should be sending Russia and Israel to Coventry, if that analogy makes any sense in Australia, because if we can't force them, maybe we can shame them into better behavior. And that's not a great prospect, but it's something.
Okay, last one, because the last two on our slide are really more comments than questions. Could we've gone from the ASEAN to EU, now getting even bigger? Could the UN ever be strong enough to be a forum for genuine cooperation between all or most nations?
Excellent question. In theory, there's no reason why it shouldn't be. There's a wonderful book by the president of Finland, who's I bet nobody can name, Alexander Stubb. It's called Triangle of Power, and he makes a compelling argument from a middle power perspective that the revitalization of the United Nations is exactly what we need. The scrapping of the old Security Council and the incorporation of lots of other parts of the region, of the world, from Africa, Asia, etc., that they should be incorporated. Again, you get into the problem of lots of players means lots of different points of view, and it's very difficult to organize. But human survival on in a civilized way, I would have thought that's something that most people could probably get on board with. But that is until we kind of recognize that that's the real threat facing humanity at the moment. And if we don't get our act together, I mean, it could be game over, or any game you want to be a part of. And for those of you who know anything about political theory, read your Thomas Hobbes. I mean, the war of all against war, all against all. I mean, that's what we're looking at, unless we do something quite remarkable, quite unprecedented, and probably pretty unlikely. But anyway, I'm 74. What do I care? I don't have to worry about it. But youngsters, people with kids, I just don't understand why people aren't a bit more worked up about this. But there you go.
Well, Mark, on that
Cheery note.
cheery note, salutary note, slightly optimistic note that somewhere cooperation is possible. We might just call it a day and say thanks very much for your presentation. Just make sure everybody who's watching, you can go back and get a video of this. Also, Mark's slides will be up there as well. And Mark, it's a great pleasure to have you again, and we'll see you soon. Okay,
Thanks very much, John. Great talk to you. Thank you.
Okay, and
Thanks for all for tuning in.
Everybody else, just letting you know, the next Curtain Corner is in 2 weeks' time, because it's a long weekend this weekend. We won't have one next Friday, but on the 12th of June, our presenter will be the new WA Ombudsman, Bevan Warner. So I hope you can join us then. But for now, thanks for watching. Have a great long weekend. Good night. See you later.